Naomi Davis had spent the entire day at the FBI's headquarters reviewing case files and prepping for a high-stakes operation that had her nerves on edge. After hours of intense meetings and phone calls, all she wanted was to drive home, kick off her heels, and unwind it. With a cup of tea, it was a routine that kept her grounded after all the constant pressure of her job often left her with little room for normally as she drove along the quiet tree-lined streets of the city. Not breathe a sigh of relief, allowing her mind to drift from the day's challenges. The hum of her car's engine was a soothing sound in the otherwise silent evening. Her thoughts wandered, reflecting on the hard work ahead, the missions that were becoming more difficult by the day, but the serenity of the moment was shattered when she noticed the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A quick glance confirmed what she'd feared: a police cruiser. She swallowed the lump in her throat, irritation bubbling up. It wasn't that she had done anything wrong, it was the fact that despite all her credentials, she couldn't escape the biases tied to her identity. Reluctantly, Naomi signaled and pulled her car over to the curb, coming to a stop just beneath the dim glow of a street light. She didn't know it yet, but this stop would become a defining moment, one that would spark change, but only after a clash that Naomi had neither anticipated nor deserved. As the cruiser rolled to a stop behind her, Naomi sat still, her fingers lightly gripping the steering. Well, she wasn't nervous, not by a long shot. She'd been through countless encounters with law enforcement in her years as an FBI agent, but something about this moment felt different. The world beyond the car seemed unusually quiet, the late night breeze carrying only the faint sound of distant traffic. The officer emerged from the car with a slow, deliberate pace, his boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Naomi noted his uniform, dark blue, with the name Officer Ryan embroidered over his chest. He was tall with a strong build, but his posture was stiff, and his approach exuded the kind of arrogance that Naomi had seen all too often. She could feel his eyes on her before he even reached the driver's side window. He knocked on the window, his face a mask of disdain. Naomi rolled it down, her expression neutral. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Naomi glanced up at the rearview mirror, checking to ensure she hadn't missed any signage or traffic rules. Everything seemed fine. She looked back at the officer, her voice calm and controlled. "No, officer, I don't." Ryan paused, scanning her face, his eyes narrowing slightly. Naomi couldn't help but notice the way his gaze lingered, a subtle sign of suspicion that didn't match the usual protocol. For a routine stop, she felt her skin prickling, the familiar weight of being judged by her appearance rather than her actions. She resisted the urge to sigh. "You were speeding," he said flatly, his eyes never leaving her license and registration. Naomi's brow furrowed. She had been driving at a steady pace, the flow of traffic around her clear. "I'm sorry, officer, but I don't believe I was speeding." "Are you sure you're reading your radar correctly?" Ryan's lip curled into a smug grin, and Naomi could tell instantly that this wasn't going to be an ordinary interaction. "I said license and registration." She could feel the tension in his voice, an undercurrent of aggression masked by thin politeness. Naomi was familiar with this tactic. It was something she had seen often in her years as an investigator, the way certain officers would escalate situations purely out of a need to assert their authority. This was no ordinary stop. She knew that it had less to do with the speeding violation and more to do with her. Still, she remained calm. She reached into her glove compartment and handed over her registration and driver's license. Ryan glanced down at the documents, then back up at her, still staring intently, though now with a palpable contempt. His eyes seemed to linger on her dark skin, as though he could somehow use that to define her. "You're not from around here, are you?" Ryan asked, his voice low, almost challenging. Naomi wasn't sure what he meant by that. Her car wasn't registered in this neighborhood, but that didn't give him any right to question her further. She decided to answer as professionally as possible. I live nearby. I'm just heading home from work. Ryan's gaze remained cold. He was still scrutinizing her, and Naomi had the distinct feeling that this wasn't just about a traffic violation. She had been through enough of these interactions, enough to recognize that underlying sense of superiority and the quiet judgment in his eyes. She knew what was coming next. You sure about that? He asked, stepping closer to her window, his voice thick with a tone of condescension. You look a little out of place. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. There it was, the subtle, racially charged implication that she didn't belong. Her hand tightened around the steering wheel, but she kept her voice. I assure you, officer, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I'm just trying to get home. Ryan stepped back, still holding her documents in one hand. You'd better hope so, he muttered before leaning over to his patrol car to run her information. The sound of his radio crackling filled the silence as he called in her details. Naomi sat still, waiting. The seconds felt like minutes as Naomi sat in her car, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. She could see Officer Ryan talking into his radio. His back turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if he was just trying to find an excuse to escalate the situation further. She had seen this kind of thing before, where an officer would stretch out the process to pressure or intimidate, but Naomi had learned long ago that remaining calm and collected was the best approach in these situations. Her years of training as an FBI agent had taught her how to read people and anticipate their moves, and right now she was fully aware that Ryan wasn't just conducting a normal traffic stop. She could feel his eyes shift toward her as he walked back to her car, her documents still in his hand. This time his posture was different, less rigid, more confrontational. Naomi braced herself for whatever was to come. The tension between them was palpable, and she had the distinct feeling that Ryan was looking for a reason to make this encounter more difficult than it needed to be. She inhaled deeply, preparing herself to deal with whatever came next. Ryan approached the driver's side window once again, his steps slow, deliberate, as he leaned in to hand her back her documents. His eyes met hers. There was something almost calculating in his gaze now, like he was sizing her up, trying to figure out who she was. Naomi didn't flinch. She had learned to remain unfazed in these moments, no matter how uncomfortable they became. So you're really just heading home? He asked, his voice still dripping with skepticism. Naomi didn't flinch at his question. Yes, officer, just going home. I've had a long day. Ryan's lips curled into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Right, he muttered. He then stepped back a few paces, eyes still lingering on her, his gaze more pointed now. There was something in his demeanor, something Naomi couldn't quite put her finger on, that told her he wasn't ready to let her go. I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle, ma'am, Brian said, his tone firm, though there was an edge to it. Now, just a routine search standard procedure. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She knew this was a tactic often used to intimidate people, especially people of color. He was trying to push her into a situation where she would feel compelled to comply out of fear of the consequences, but Naomi was trained for moments like this. She knew her rights. I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline, she said evenly, her voice calmed but firm. I've done nothing wrong, officer. You have no grounds to search my vehicle. Ryan's eyes flickered with irritation, his jaw tightening. He wasn't used to being challenged, and it was clear from his body language that he was growing more agitated. Naomi kept her eyes on him, unflinching, waiting for him to make the next move. Listen, I don't have time for games, okay? Ryan spat. His voice was suddenly sharp, laced with anger. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call for backup. We'll see if you've got something to hide. Naomi knew this was a bluff. He didn't want to escalate things to that level, but he was hoping that her fear would take over. It didn't. She had faced more intense situations than this, and Ryan's aggression was nothing compared to the kind of pressure she regularly handled as an FBI agent. Still, she needed to end this encounter before it went any further. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice steady. "I'm not hiding anything, officer. I'm an FBI agent." She paused for a beat, letting the weight of her words settle. "And I'm off duty right now, but that doesn't change the fact that you're illegally detaining me. You can call for backup if you want, but you'd better be ready for some questions." When they arrived, the air around them seemed to shift, a momentary silence hanging between them as Ryan's face froze, his expression one of stunned disbelief. His posture shifted slightly, as if the sudden knowledge of who she was had caused him to reconsider the whole situation. Naomi could almost see the gears turning in his head, the realization slowly dawning on him. She could feel the heat of his embarrassment begin to radiate through the air, but she didn't allow herself to take pleasure in it. Ryan took a slow step back, his hand still gripping her documents. His lips parted as though he was about to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he simply stood there staring at her, momentarily speechless. Naomi watched him carefully, noting the shift in his demeanor. Gone was the arrogant, aggressive officer. Now he seemed like a man who had just realized he was in way over his head. I didn't know." Ryan stammered, his voice suddenly less confident, more defensive. He shook his head as though trying to shake off the shock of the revelation. "I didn't." He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now, ma'am, I apologize. I didn't mean to." Naomi cut him off, her voice steady but with a hint of authority. "You didn't mean to what? Officer, you didn't mean to harass me. You didn't mean to break the law." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, clearly aware that there was no reasonable explanation for his actions. The tension in the air was thick, now like a storm cloud hanging just above them, ready to burst. "I'm going to need you to step back and take your hands off my documents," Naomi said, her tone sharp, no longer giving him any room for hesitation. "This encounter is over. You're free to go back to your patrol now." Ryan stood there for a moment longer, his eyes wide, his mind clearly trying to catch up with the unexpected turn of events. Finally, he slowly stepped away from her car, his head hanging low. Naomi could see the visible signs of discomfort in his body language, the slight slouch in his shoulders, the way his hand kept rubbing the back of his neck. It was clear he was still processing the reality of what had just happened. As Naomi rolled up her window and prepared to drive away, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. Ryan may have backed down, but she knew this was far from over. He had to be held accountable, not just for his behavior toward her, but for the countless others he'd likely treated the same way. Naomi took a deep breath, starting the engine and pulling away. The street was silent once again, the only sound being the hum of her tires against the road. She glanced in her rearview mirror, watching the officer's cruiser fade into the distance, knowing that this encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. As Naomi drove away from the scene, the adrenaline from the confrontation began to settle, but her mind was still racing. Her calm exterior had masked the torrent of thoughts that had spiraled inside her. She had been caught off guard by the officer's initial behavior, and despite how it had ended, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had dealt with her fair share of racist encounters in her career, both within this force and outside of it, but Ryan's actions had been overt and aggressive in a way that left a bitter taste in her mouth. The drive home was long, and Naomi couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her head. She thought about what had happened, how the officer had aggressively pulled her over for no good reason, how he had treated her as though she were guilty before even giving her a chance to explain. The more she thought about it, the more enraged she became, not just at the officer's behavior, but at the systemic issue of police discrimination that she had witnessed all too often. By the time Naomi arrived at her apartment, it was well past midnight. She parked in the lot, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her fingers tight with frustration. The familiar sight of her small, modest apartment building provided little comfort. She had expected to come home, unwind, and find some semblance of peace. Instead, she felt the weight of the encounter pressing on her chest. The feeling of helplessness lingered in her mind like an unwelcome guest. She stepped out of her car and walked toward the building, her thoughts still spinning. She knew that what happened to her wasn't just an isolated incident. She had heard countless stories of people, especially Black people, being targeted by law enforcement for reasons beyond their control. But what made her situation different was her position. She wasn't just any citizen. She was an FBI agent, a respected professional, a woman who had worked tirelessly to earn her place in the agency. Yet despite all that, she had been subjected to the same biases and suspicion that many others faced on a daily basis. Inside her apartment, she tossed her purse onto the couch and walked toward the kitchen. She needed something to clear her mind. The kettle whistled, signaling that her tea was ready. She poured the boiling water over the tea bag, watching as the rich amber liquid could swirled, her thoughts drifting again as the minutes passed. The heat of the tea in her hands began to soothe her, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm inside her. Then her phone rang. Naomi glanced at the screen. It was a call from her partner, Elijah Harris. He had been with the FBI for almost as long as she had, and though they didn't always work together, their partnership had become a close one over the years. She answered quickly. "Nami, what's going on?" "I heard about the incident with the cop." Elijah's voice crackled through the phone. Naomi paused, unsure of how much she wanted to share. She didn't want to appear rattled, but she knew Elijah wouldn't drop it until she said something. "I'm fine," Naomi replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of tension. It was a routine stop, except it wasn't Elijah's side. "I figured as much. Is this another one of those we need to have a talk about? Racial profiling situations?" Naomi leaned against the counter, her grip tightening on her cup. "You could say that, but it was more than that, Elijah. It wasn't just profiling. He came at me aggressively. I could feel the way he was looking at me, like I wasn't even supposed to be there. And I had to remind him I wasn't some random person on the street. I'm an agent." "Elijah." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Elijah spoke again. "This isn't just about one officer, Naomi. It's about something much bigger. You know how deep the biases run. That cop didn't know who you were. He just saw a Black woman and decided you were an easy target. The fact that he was shocked when you revealed your identity shows how little regard he had for you as a person before that moment." Naomi's grip on the cup loosened, but the frustration still burned inside her eye. "No, I don't know what to do about it. I shouldn't have to explain myself. Elijah, I'm done with people thinking they can treat me like that. You shouldn't have to." Elijah agreed. "But you got to keep fighting, Naomi, and you're not alone in this. We're all in this fight together, but we can't let it slide." Naomi took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She didn't want to feel helpless, but there was only so much she could do on her own. "I know, but it's exhausting. It wears you down." "I get it," Elijah said, his tone softer now. "But think about it. You're in a position where you can make a real difference, not just for yourself, but for others who don't have the same platform. You're one of the few who can stand up and say this isn't okay." Naomi closed her eyes, taking another breath. Elijah's words were comforting, but the sting of what had happened still lingered. She wasn't sure what the next step would be. She didn't have the answers. She didn't even know if she wanted to take this any further, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't just let it go. "Not this time, thanks, Elijah," she said finally, her voice steady. "Again, I'll figure it out, but I can't keep letting this slide. Not after tonight." "I know," Elijah said, "and you don't have to do it alone. Just remember, we're in this fight together." Naomi ended the call and sat back on the couch, staring at the walls of her apartment. It was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of her refrigerator in the background. But the silence felt different tonight. Heavier. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It never was, but she also knew that she had the power to stand up for what was right. and for the first time in a long while, Naomi felt a spark of determination ignite inside her. She wouldn't let this go, not now, not ever. It was a few days after the confrontation with Officer Ryan when Naomi decided to follow through with her instincts. She couldn't let the encounter slide without addressing it. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that she needed to bring this to light, not only for herself, but for the larger conversation surrounding systemic racism and law enforcement. As much as she hated confrontation, Naomi had always known that sometimes you had to stand up even when it was uncomfortable. After speaking with Elijah, Naomi reached out to a trusted colleague, Detective Marcus Hayes, who was also an advocate for police reform. Marcus had been a longtime ally, someone she could always count on for guidance and support when it came to issues of racial justice within law enforcement. She arranged a meeting with at a local cafe, hoping to discuss the situation in more detail and figure out her next steps. When she arrived, Marcus was already seated, his broad shoulders hunched over a cup of coffee. His eyes were sharp, always observant, and as soon as he saw Naomi, a slight smile tugged at his lips. He gestured for her to sit. Naomi, good to see you. Okay? You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, Marcus said, offering a reassuring tone. Naomi sat down across from him, rubbing her temples as if the last few days had taken a physical toll on her. She had hoped the meeting would give her some clarity, but the turmoil in her mind still weighed heavily. It's been a rough few days. I can't stop thinking about what happened. I never thought I'd be in that position. I've seen this happen to so many others, but to be on the receiving end, it's different. Marcus nodded knowingly. You do